Have you ever noticed how you completely change your demeanor depending on the social stage you're on?
Oh, absolutely.
Perhaps you're incredibly outgoing, boisterous with your closest friends, but then you walk into a professional meeting and suddenly you're the picture of quiet thoughtfulness measured in every word.
Yeah, the shift can be really dramatic.
Or maybe you've observed a child who's the undisputed leader of a wild, imaginative game on the playground, directing everyone with confident shouts. But then a few minutes later in the classroom, they're quiet, perhaps even a little reserved, diligently following instructions.
Right, like completely different kids sometimes.
It's like we inhabit different versions of ourselves depending on where we are and, crucially, who we're with. And this fascinating phenomenon immediately begs a fundamental question. Who are we, really, at our core, and why do we act the way we do in such different situations?
That's a question that cuts right to the very core of human experience and identity, doesn't it? We often carry this intuitive idea that our identity is a fixed internal thing, a sort of pre-programmed essence we're born with.
Right, like it's just in there somewhere.
Exactly. An immutable, unchanging part of our being, just waiting to unfold.
Yeah.
But what if that intuition, while comforting, isn't quite the full picture? What if our identity is far more fluid, more dynamic, constantly being shaped and reshaped by the world around us and by every single interaction we have?
That's precisely what we're here to explore today in the deep dive. Our mission is to embark on a truly fascinating journey to understand identity through the incredibly powerful and insightful lens of what's known as symbolic interactionism. Now, this isn't just some abstract sociological concept locked away in academic towers. It's a framework that offers truly practical, profound, and often surprising insights into how our understanding of ourselves is intimately woven with the social world we inhabit, and crucially, how we in turn actively shape that very world moment by moment.
And for you, our listener, especially if you're navigating or preparing to navigate the vibrant, complex world of elementary education, this deep dive is going to be incredibly valuable.
Yeah, absolutely.
These aren't just theories confined to dense academic journals. They are potent, actionable tools for dissecting the intricate dynamics within a classroom, for truly understanding the nuances of student behavior, both individual and collective, and even for reflecting on your own evolving professional identity as a teacher.
Yeah, getting a real handle on that.
Our goal is to give you a shortcut to being truly well-informed, to provide you with those aha moments, those surprising facts and practical applications that you can immediately relate to your daily experiences in the classroom, fostering deeper understanding and more effective teaching.
And to guide us through this intricate landscape, we've drawn heavily from an indispensable source, the foundational text by Richard T. Serpy and Sheldon Stryker on symbolic interactionist perspectives and identity theory.
A really key piece of work.
It really is. This comprehensive guide, found within the Handbook of Identity Theory and Research, is going to help us unpack these complex, yet utterly vital ideas about who we are and how we become ourselves in the social world. So let's unpack this big question. Where do our ideas of ourselves actually come from? We've all felt that subtle, sometimes dramatic shift, haven't we? Stepping from one social context to another and sensing a different you emerge.
Definitely.
Is it really a fixed identity, a pre-programmed self we're born with? Or is it something more akin to a grand construction project, where we add a brick day by day, interaction by interaction, building who we are in real time?
It's a question that sociologists and psychologists have grappled with for centuries, really. And a particularly powerful framework, symbolic interactionism, or SI as we'll often refer to it, offers a compelling answer. Our self is fundamentally social. It's not something innate that simply unfolds from within. Rather, it's something that emerges through our continuous interactions with others and the shared meanings we create in those interactions.
Fundamentally social.
Yeah.
So not just influenced by society, but made by it.
In a very real sense, yes.
Yeah.
You can trace the very seeds of these ideas way back, actually, to the 18th century Scottish moral philosophers, thinkers, like Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, and David Hume.
Oh, wow. Okay. Going back that far.
Yeah. While they weren't talking about symbolic interactionism by name, of course, their core assertion was profoundly influential for what would become SI. They believed that human nature is inherently social. They saw society not as a mere collection of isolated individuals, but as something dynamically built, brick by brick, moment by moment, through communication and relationships. And here's the crucial, almost poetic part that provides our first aha moment. They argued that society acts as a mirror in which people see themselves.
A mirror, that's such a vivid and immediate image. So it's not just about what we think of ourselves internally, but how others reflect us back, giving us a clearer view of ourselves.
Precisely. To give you a concrete analogy, especially for someone deeply interested in elementary education, think about a new student entering a classroom for the very first time.
Right, that first day anxiety.
Exactly. They don't arrive with a fully formed, predefined identity for that specific classroom environment. Their initial sense of who they are in this new space, are they smart, shy, funny, a good listener, troublemaker? All of that is reflected back to them.
How so?
Well, it's reflected by how the teacher greets them. The warmth of their smile, the tone of voice used, the explicit and implicit expectations communicated.
Okay.
It's reflected by how other students react to their presence, their attempts to join a game on the playground during recess, or their contributions to a discussion during circle time.
Yeah, kids can be brutally honest mirrors sometimes.
They certainly can be. And it's even reflected by the explicit rules and, the hidden curriculum of the classroom itself, like whether quiet participation is valued more than boisterous engagement. That continuous feedback, that social mirror, is what helps them begin to construct and refine their identity within that particular social context. It's an ongoing dialogue between self and society.
That makes so much sense. It really is a continuous feedback loop, isn't it? Building on those early ideas of the social mirror, how did this concept evolve, particularly with someone like George Herbert Mead, who's often cited as the philosophical father of symbolic interactionism?
Mead, yeah, the early 20th century, he really synthesized and advanced these foundational ideas. He was influenced by contemporaries like Charles Horton Cooley, who gave us the concept of the looking glass self.
Ah, right, the looking glass self.
Yeah.
Similar idea.
Very similar. And John Dewey as well. Mead became the foremost philosophical precursor to SI. For Mead, the social process itself is primary. Society and the self don't pre-exist as fixed entities. They're constantly being created through interaction. He argued that mind, self, and society emerge from this dynamic social process, often facilitated by what he called significant symbols.
Significant symbols. What are those exactly? Are they like road signs for conversation, like universal gestures or something?
That's a good way to think about it, yeah. Significant symbols are essentially gestures or language that have common meaning for all participants in an interaction. They are symbols that elicit the same response in both the person making the gesture and the person perceiving it.
Okay, give me an example.
Okay, so if I raise my hand in the classroom,
Yeah.
and everyone understands that means I have a question, that's a significant symbol. Or if I say the word tree, and you immediately picture a leafy, woody plant, that's a significant symbol. This shared understanding is how we cooperate, how we truly understand each other's intentions, and how we coordinate our behaviors. Without these commonly understood symbols, effective social interaction, thus society itself, would be impossible. We'd all be speaking different languages, literally and figuratively.
Right, chaos.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And this leads to another crucial concept for Mead. Taking the attitude of the other, or what's often called role-taking.
Role-taking. Putting yourself in someone else's shoes.
Quite literally, yes. He argued that we understand others by imagining their perspective, anticipating their responses, and then coordinating our own behavior accordingly. But it's not just about understanding others, it's also how we come to see ourselves objectively, to think reflexively about our own actions, intentions, and even our appearance. We internalize the perspectives of others and see ourselves through their eyes, allowing us to self-critique and adapt.
So we're constantly running little mental simulations of how others might react to us, using their perspectives to adjust our own. That's really insightful. And this brings us to Mead's famous concepts of the I and the me, right? These sound like the twin engines of the self.
Yes, absolutely. These are two fundamental, always interacting aspects of the self for Mead in a dynamic and continuous relationship. The me is the self as an object. It's the part of us that's a product of interaction within society, shaped by how others see us, and by the expectations of the group, what Mead called the generalized other.
The generalized other, like society's expectations rolled into one.
Exactly. Think of the generalized other as the internalized attitudes and expectations of the broader community or group. So the me is our internalized sense of societal norms, roles, and expectations. It's the organized set of attitudes of others which one himself assumes. It's the socialized self.
Okay, the socialized self. And the I.
Then there's the I. The I is pure impulse, spontaneity, creativity. It's the immediate, unreflective response of the individual to the attitudes of others and the expectations of society. It's the part of us that can introduce novelty, innovation, and sometimes even disruption into the social world. It's our personal agency, our unique contribution to the ongoing social process, the acting self.
So the me is the socialized self, the conformist almost, and
Yep.
the I is the spontaneous, maybe rebellious self, and they're constantly in conversation. It feels like a constant negotiation.
Precisely. Mead saw them in an ongoing dialectic relationship, a continuous internal conversation. The I reacts to the me, which is itself a product of society. And through this constant interplay, society itself is continuously being created and recreated. It's never a fixed, static entity.
Wow.
And here's where it gets truly fascinating. This dynamic tension between the I and the me is how we grow, how society adapts, and how change happens. It's not just a philosophical concept, it's a constant lived reality.
Can you give a classroom example of that? The I and the me.
Sure. Imagine a child in your classroom during, say, quiet reading time. Their me might be shaped by the classroom expectation that during this period, everyone sits quietly and focuses on their book. That's the internalized, generalized other for that specific situation.
Right, the rule-following part.
Yes. But their I might be the spontaneous urge to blurt out a funny comment about a character in their book, or maybe to ask a tangential question that just popped into their head.
Happens all the time.
Right. Now, how the teacher and other peers react to that I moment with a laugh, a gentle reminder, a disciplinary action, or perhaps an encouragement to share after reading time, that reaction then feeds back and helps to reshape the child's me in that specific context.
So the reaction molds the me over time.
Exactly. This constant give and take means the classroom, as a mini-society, is never static. It's always evolving, adapting, and being co-created by everyone within it. The I keeps things from becoming totally rigid.
That's a profound point about society never being fixed. So what are some of the broader implications of Mead's thinking for how we understand human behavior and social life?
Well, first, it implies that societies are in a constant process of institutionalizing solutions to collective problems. Think about how a classroom might develop new rules or routines when a new learning technology, say a set of interactive tablets, is introduced.
Yeah, things have to adapt.
Exactly. The existing rules of interaction, the roles of teacher and student, might need to be renegotiated and recreated to effectively integrate that technology. And similarly, societies undergo constant change as novel problems emerge from their social environments, requiring new me structures to respond to the I impulses.
Okay, constant adaptation. What else?
Second, Mead's ideas strongly imply that both mind and self are intrinsically social phenomena. They come into being and can only exist through the process of communicating via those significant symbols we discussed.
So no society, no self. That's pretty radical.
It is a radical idea.
Yeah.
Without social interaction, without that shared symbolic world, there is no self, no mind in the uniquely human sense that allows for complex thought and self-reflection. Our very consciousness is a social product.
Wow. Okay. Any other major implications?
And a third implication, which is often a point of critique, actually, is that Mead's original model of the social actor, by focusing heavily on rational, problem-solving interactions, tends to neglect the role of affect or emotion.
Oh, right. It sounds very cognitive, very thinking-focused.
It does. He modeled the social actor somewhat like a scientist conducting an experiment, very logical. However, later theories within symbolic interactionism, which we'll definitely get into, directly address this gap, integrating the powerful role of emotions into how identity is formed and maintained.
Okay, good. So here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Even within this broad symbolic interactionist framework, different thinkers took somewhat different paths, right? Almost diverging into distinct philosophical approaches to how we should study identity and the social self. It's not a simple single theory, but a rich, ongoing conversation.
That's right. And this raises an important methodological question. How do we actually study something as fluid, as dynamic, and as subjectively experienced as human interaction and self-definition? It's not a straightforward task, and the different paths reflected different answers to that challenge.
So what were the main paths?
Well, on one side, we have what's called traditional symbolic interactionism, famously championed by Herbert Blumer. Blumer, who actually coined the term symbolic interactionism itself.
Oh, okay. He named it.
He did. He argued passionately that the pursuit of a grand, general, predictive theory of human behavior is largely futile. His reasoning was that meanings, definitions, and interpretations of situations are continuously reformulated in interaction.
Meaning things change too fast to predict.
Essentially, yes. We don't just apply pre-existing scripts. We constantly construct our behavior anew in the course of activity, interpreting and reinterpreting as we go. Therefore, the meanings applicable at one point in time might not hold true at the very next.
So if meanings are always shifting, like sand beneath our feet, how can you ever hope to predict anything with certainty? It sounds like you're trying to hit a moving target.
Exactly Bloomer's point. He concluded that sociologists could achieve rich, nuanced, after-the-fact understandings of social behavior, explaining why something happened, but they couldn't hope for theory-based explanations that could predict behavior with precision across all contexts.
Okay. And how did he think we should study it then?
He was quite skeptical of conventional numerical methods, like surveys and stacks, arguing they simply couldn't capture the rich, nuanced, subjective meanings. Instead, he emphasized what he called exploration and inspection as core research processes.
Exploration and inspection, what does that involve?
Exploration meant using anything that allowed research subjects to speak in their own voice, to reveal their subjective worlds. This would include deeply listening to everyday conversations, using what we now call focus groups, conducting extensive, in-depth interviews, or poring over personal documents like life histories, letters, and diaries.
So really getting into their heads, their perspectives.
Totally. Immersing oneself in their lived experience. Inspection then involved developing, testing, and revising initial images and conceptions derived from that direct observation and exploration, constantly challenging assumptions and returning to the data to uncover generic relationships and sharpen concepts. It was meant to be flexible, imaginative, creative discovery over rigid hypothesis testing.
So a traditional SI approach sounds very much focused on the unique, unfolding story of an individual or specific group, prioritizing their perspective and giving them a voice. It's like being a detective of meaning.
Precisely. If you as a teacher were taking a traditional SI approach in your classroom, you might choose to deeply observe a specific student's interactions throughout the day. You'd carefully journal your detailed observations of how they engage with peers during free play, how they respond to your instructions during a lesson, or how they react to challenges like a difficult math problem.
Oh, right, the nitty-gritty details.
Exactly. Beyond just observing, you might conduct informal, open-ended interviews with that student to understand their unique interpretations of classroom events, their feelings about peer relationships, or what a certain task means to them. The focus wouldn't be on trying to fit their behavior into a general theory of student behavior, but on understanding that individual's singular, unfolding experience in its full complexity, giving primacy to their subjective reality.
And then on the other side, we have structural symbolic interactionism. This sounds like a very different beast, aiming for something more generalizable, maybe.
Indeed. The major countervoice to Bloomer was Manfred H. Kuhn, and later Sheldon Stryker, whose work is central to our source material today. Kuhn, labeling his framework self-theory, aspired to precisely what Bloomer thought futile, providing precise, theory-based generalizations and their rigorous empirical test.
So the opposite goal, almost.
Pretty much. While acknowledging that social structure is fundamentally created and maintained through symbolic interaction, structural SI asserts that once created, that structure takes on a life of its own and constrains further interaction.
Like building a house? The walls constrain you once they're up.
That's a perfect analogy. Once the walls are up, the roof is on, and the rooms are designed, they physically define the space and limit the possibilities for future activities within it. You can move furniture around, but you can't easily change the fundamental layout. Structure shapes interaction.
Okay. And how does this perspective see the self?
This perspective brought in ideas of social roles and reference groups with greater emphasis. Our self isn't a singular amorphous blob. It's composed of many distinct parts, tied to various positions we occupy, status identifications we claim, and role expectations associated with those positions.
So lots of different selves based on our roles.
Sort of, yes. Multiple facets. Structural SI also maintain the idea of a stable core self that provides continuity across different roles, but crucially, it still allowed for creativity through the process of role-taking and interpretation, meaning we don't just robotically enact roles, there's still agency.
And how did their methods differ, given these different aims? Did they also use different tools in their detective work? Did they use surveys and things?
That's a key distinction. Yes, they did. Unlike Bloomer's strong emphasis on qualitative, naturalistic methods, structural SI embraces a much wider range of social science methods. This includes quantitative approaches like large-scale surveys, statistical analysis, and even experiments.
Oh, okay.
Because they believe in the possibility of developing generalizable, testable theories about social behavior. They seek to identify patterns and predict likelihoods, not just understand unique instances.
So how would that approach look in a classroom, the structural one?
Okay, let's bring this back to the classroom for a structural SI perspective. Instead of focusing solely on one student's unique journey, this approach might investigate how a school's established grading system, which is a pre-existing social structure, actually constrains a student's study habits and even their self-perception as a learner.
Right, like how grades influence what kids study or how they feel about a subject.
Exactly. For instance, if the system heavily rewards rote memorization and penalizes creative problem solving, it might subtly discourage deeper, more exploratory learning approaches, thus shaping student behavior and their student identity towards compliance rather than critical thinking.
Makes sense.
Or it might look at how the explicitly defined role of group leader in a classroom project shapes specific student behaviors over time, regardless of which particular student occupies that role.
Because the role itself has power.
Yes, because the role itself carries a set of expectations and constraints that influence behavior. It seeks to generalize patterns and explain how social structures influence interaction.
So, while they both originate from the same basic insights about meaning and interaction, they clearly have different aims and preferred tools. Can you quickly highlight their commonalities and key differences? I know there's a famous table in the source material that lays this out, but just the gist.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that both traditional and structural symbolic interactionism share fundamental bedrock beliefs. They both see society as a dynamic web of communication and interaction, where meanings are developed and negotiated through that interaction.
Okay, interaction is key for both.
Yes. They agree the society is basic to the development of self, and that our self-concepts then actively guide our social behavior. And crucially, they both see humans as active, creative agents, not just passive recipients of social forces. And they recognize that subjective experience, the individual's interpretation of reality, is absolutely crucial to understanding human behavior.
So a lot of common ground, actually.
Definitely. However, they diverge significantly in their approach. Traditional SI tends to be more skeptical about the predictability of social life, viewing interaction as continuously newly constructed in the moment. It generally downplays the role of larger, enduring social structures.
Focusing on the immediate situation.
Right, focusing instead on the fluid, immediate definitions of situations. And as we discussed, it strongly prefers qualitative, naturalistic methods, often studying a small set of interactions in depth.
Okay, and structural.
In contrast, structural SI believes there's enough continuity and patterning in social life to justify seeking empirical generalizations and even predictions. It sees social structure as a crucial, enduring constraint that influences definitions and behavior, even as it acknowledges that structure is socially constructed.
Structure matters more.
It incorporates sociological observer perspectives alongside participant perspectives, allowing for a more objective analysis, perhaps. And it is open to the widest range of social science methods, including quantitative ones, for analysis and testing of theories. It's a broader methodological toolkit aimed at a different level of theoretical understanding.
That distinction is really clear now. It sounds like a debate between focusing on the unique, rich story versus the underlying generalizable patterns. But is it still such a strict either-or today? Or have things softened a bit?
That's a great question, and the good news is that, historically, yes, this variation between the two interactionist perspectives was often posed in stark either-or terms. But today, there's a growing realization that this isn't necessarily required, and indeed isn't fully productive.
People see value in both.
Increasingly, yes. Social life may be fundamentally undetermined at the micro level, but both self and pre-existing social structures clearly impact behavior. Subjective experiences are vital and irreplaceable, but they are also deeply rooted in and shaped by social structure. In reality, both social construction and reconstruction, as well as stability and change, are all observable characteristics of social life. This means that both general concepts and specific details are useful, and both quantitative and qualitative methods can be strategically employed to achieve a fuller, more robust understanding. We fully expect a rich blend of creativity and stability in social life, and our theories should reflect that.
That makes sense. A blended approach is probably more realistic. And for our deep dive today, given our source material's strengths, which path are we primarily focusing on?
For our purposes today, we're going to primarily focus on the structural, symbolic interactionist perspective. This is largely because it has a greater capacity to generate empirically testable theories, which is a core strength highlighted in the Serpent and Stryker text.
Okay, so focusing on the testable theories part.
Right. Its key premise, slightly rephrased to acknowledge that society exists prior to any new individual's arrival, but is also constantly remade, is that society shapes self, which shapes social interaction, while always recognizing the reciprocal nature of these relationships.
Society shapes self, self shapes interaction, but it goes both ways.
Exactly. From this viewpoint, society is conceptualized not as a random collection of individuals, but as a differentiated yet organized mosaic of role relationships, groups, networks, and institutions. This mosaic is, of course, cross-cut by large-scale structures like age, gender, and ethnicity, which profoundly influence our experiences.
Like layers of organization.
Precisely. So, for example, consider the classroom itself as a small, organized society. It has its own rules, its own distinct roles, teacher, student, group leader, friend, class clown. And these roles are profoundly influenced by students' age, gender, and socioeconomic background. All of these elements collectively shape the identities that emerge within that specific space. These structures, in essence, define the boundaries, who interacts with whom, about what topics, and with what resources. They define the playing field, if you will, for identity construction and expression.
So what does this all mean for truly understanding our own identities and those of the people around us, especially in a dynamic environment like a classroom where so many identities are forming and colliding? This brings us to identity theory, which sounds like it's a direct outgrowth of this structural approach designed to be precise and testable.
That's exactly right. If we connect this to the bigger picture, identity theory indeed emerged directly from the structural symbolic interactionist frame. Its very purpose was to take that broad, powerful premise of society shapes self, which shapes social behavior, and make it precise enough to be empirically testable, to be something we could study systematically.
Because the original statement was a bit too broad for research.
Exactly. It was too vague for rigorous research, so the theorists had to specify each term. Let's start with the outcome variable, social behavior. Identity theory narrows this down, specifying it as role choice behavior.
Role choice behavior. Okay.
It asks, why does one person choose to engage in one activity or adopt one role over another when other options are available? The classic original example was, why does one man choose to spend a free weekend afternoon taking his children to the zoo, embodying a father identity? While another chooses to spend that same time on the golf course with his buddies, embodying a golfer or friend identity.
That's a great relatable question, highlighting the everyday choices we make. So applying that to your classroom, it would be what? Why one kid plays tag and another reads.
Exactly that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Why does one student consistently choose to spend their free time helping a peer with homework, really embodying a helper or tutor identity, while another student chooses to immediately go play a game during recess, actively enacting a playmate identity?
Okay.
Or why does a student consistently volunteer for leadership roles in group projects, actively enacting a leader identity, while another student consistently chooses a more passive collaborative role? Identity theory aims to provide a systematic explanation for these specific observable choices.
Got it. So that's the behavior part specified. What about the self part?
Okay, next, for the self component. Identity theory specifies it as identity salience. The idea here is that people don't have just one monolithic self that guides all their actions. They have multiple identities.
Right. We talked about that earlier. Student, friend, sibling.
Exactly. You can think of it as having as many identities as you have organized sets of role relationships in which you participate. Identity salience then refers to the likelihood that a particular identity will be invoked or brought to the forefront in various situations. It's about which identity becomes most active and guides your behavior in a given context or across contexts.
So which identity is sort of on top at any given moment?
That's a good way to put it. Which one is most prominent or probable? Identities in this framework have two key requirements. First, that people are placed as social objects by others who assign them position designations and expectations. For instance, being called teacher, student, or group leader assigns you a position.
Okay, other people label you.
And second, that they internalize those designations and associated expectations, making them a part of their self-concept. So identities are essentially self-cognitions, our internal understanding of who we are, that are tied to specific roles and, through those roles, to positions within organized social relationships.
So it's internal and tied to social roles.
Yes, they act like cognitive schemata or mental frameworks that help us interpret situations, predict outcomes, and guide our choices.
Yeah.
And crucially, as cognitive schemata, They aren't situation-specific. They are relatively stable internal structures that can be carried across the multiple situations that we experience throughout our day, providing a sense of continuity to ourself.
This multiple identities idea truly resonates. We all feel like different people at different times, a quiet learner, a loud friend, a concerned sibling. So in the classroom, what would this look like with salience?
Okay, in your classroom, a single student might simultaneously hold a student identity, a friend identity, an artist identity, and even a sibling identity if they have a younger brother or sister in the same school. The question then becomes, how salient is their student identity at any given moment?
How likely is it to pop up?
Right, meaning how often does it come to mind or actively guide their behavior? This will profoundly affect whether they choose to study for test or socialize with friends after school, or perhaps prioritize an art project. When you, as the teacher, say, it's time for quiet reading and independent work, the student identity salience likely increases dramatically for many children. Hopefully. Prompting behaviors consistent with that role, like opening a book, focusing, and staying quiet. If a child has a very salient class clown identity, however, they might feel a strong pull to make a joke, even during quiet reading time, illustrating how different salient identities can compete for behavioral expression.
Right, the internal conflict. Okay, so we have role choice behavior and identity salience. What about specifying society?
Finally, identity theory specifies society, not just as a vague concept, but as commitment. And this isn't about general values or broad choices, but specifically about the interactional and affective ties to others in social networks.
Commitment means social ties.
Yes, it's defined by the degree to which your relationships with a certain group of people depend on you being a particular kind of person or playing a particular role. The stronger these ties, the more committed you are to that network, and by extension, to the identity linked to it.
So it's about how deeply embedded you are in a specific social network that reinforces and relies upon a certain identity from you. It's like your social connections are holding that identity in place.
You've understood it perfectly. The original research this concept came from looked at radical movement leaders. Those who remained deeply committed to the movement, even through hardship, were often those whose spouses were involved in the movement, whose entire social lives revolved around other movement members, and whose income, perhaps even housing, depended on movement-related activities.
So everything was tied to that identity. Leaving wasn't really an option.
Exactly. Their entire social world was tied to that identity, making disengagement incredibly costly, both socially and emotionally.
Okay, so how does commitment work in the classroom?
For your classroom context, think about a student whose commitment to their team player identity, perhaps as a member of the school's basketball team, is very high. This might be because their closest friends are all on the team, their parents attend all the games, volunteer for the booster club, and their entire social life outside of school revolves around team practices and activities.
Okay, really invested.
Totally. This high level of commitment, these dense interactional and effective ties to the team network, make that team player identity incredibly salient for them. This commitment directly influences which identity is activated in various situations, whether they prioritize team practice over a school club, for instance, and, in turn, which role choices they make in their daily lives.
So, if I'm understanding this basic identity theory model, it's a clear progression. Commitment leads to identity salience, which then directly leads to a particular role choice. It's like a causal chain.
You've got the core model. Commitment, identity, salience, role choice. That's the foundational idea. And this model has been put to the test empirically many times in diverse contexts, providing robust support.
Any examples of that research?
Yeah, absolutely. For instance, an early study back in 1978 looked at religious identity. It found that higher religious commitment, meaning more strong ties to a religious community and activities, significantly increased religious identity salience.
Okay.
And that higher salience, in turn, led to more time spent in religious roles and activities. It directly supported the model's proposed sequence.
Commitment, salience, behavior. Clear link.
Very clear. Then there was a particularly fascinating panel study that followed 320 college freshmen over their first semester, looking at 6 identities, including student and family.
Oh, interesting. What did they find?
Well, one key finding was about the reciprocal relationship between commitment and identity salience. While they certainly influence each other.
Right. It's probably not just one way.
Exactly. But the study showed that commitment's impact on salience was consistently stronger than salience's impact on commitment.
Really? So the social ties shape the identity more than the identity shapes the ties?
That's what this study suggested, yes. Think about it this way. In a school setting, a student's strong ties to a dedicated after-school science club, that deep social commitment, is likely to increase their scientist identity salience more profoundly than simply being a good science student increases their ties to that specific club.
Sure. Interesting.
The social embeddedness drives the identity activation more directly than the identity drives the embeddedness, though both play a role over time. It underscores the power of social networks in shaping who we become.
Okay, what else did that freshman study show?
This same panel study also looked at how students navigated moving to a new environment, negotiating a new social structure in college. The findings suggested that if students were able to reestablish prior social relationships, essentially recreating their earlier social environments, finding similar friend groups or activities, the structure of their identities didn't change much. They maintained continuity.
Ah, finding their niche again.
Right. But to the extent they couldn't reconstruct those prior relationships, the salience of those identities lessened.
Which makes total sense for a classroom context.
Absolutely. You might see a new student struggle if they can't recreate their best friend or popular kid identity from their old school. That inability to reestablish those validating social ties could then potentially impact the salience of their student identity or their class participant identity as their accustomed social scaffolding shifts. They might withdraw or behave differently because the old identity isn't being supported by new social ties.
So it's not just about what you carry inside, but what you can externalize and have affirmed and supported by your social world. It makes sense why transitions can be so hard.
Absolutely. The social environment is a constant feedback system. Another important finding from that freshman study examined the role of cognitive activity. That is, simply thinking and planning associated with an identity.
Just thinking about it.
Yeah. The research indicated that in addition to effective commitment, the greater the time spent thinking and planning about future role performance, the higher the identity salience.
That's powerful for teachers.
It is. A student who spends a lot of time planning their group project, rehearsing a presentation, or just thinking about their role in the school play likely has a highly salient achiever or performer identity. The mental engagement, the internal rehearsal, reinforces the identity's prominence and readiness to be activated.
So encourage the planning and thinking part.
Definitely. Furthermore, that study explored how prior social relationships relate to forming new ones. It found that students with strong family ties before entering college were much more likely to develop new social relationships in college that reproduce the close, intimate nature of their prior family interactions.
We seek out what's familiar.
It seems so. It connects to how individuals often seek out environments and relationships that affirm their existing salient identities. We are drawn to situations where we can continue to enact the kind of person we already feel we are, seeking out others who will verify and support those identities.
Okay, one more thing from that study.
Yes. The researchers also looked at a truly profound, almost counterintuitive insight: the distinction between psychological centrality and identity salience.
Okay, what's the difference there?
Psychological centrality is about how important an identity is to how the person sees themselves. It's a deep personal valuing, a core aspect of your self-concept, like being an artist is core to who I am.
Right, deep down belief.
Identity salience, as we've discussed, is the probability of invoking a specific identity across situations, how likely it is to come to the forefront and guide your behavior.
So how often it actually shows up.
Exactly. Both matter, of course. But the study showed that identity salience often had more predictive power for what people actually do in a given situation.
That's a subtle but incredibly important difference. So I might feel like being a creative writer is central to my core self. That's my psychological centrality. But if I'm in a very strict academic environment with no creative writing outlets, that writer identity might not be very salient in my day-to-day school behavior, even if it's deeply important to me personally.
You've nailed it. That's the distinction.
It challenges us to see that our context and the opportunities it provides often have more sway over our immediate actions than our deepest internal beliefs.
Exactly. It's the difference between an identity that is deeply valued internally and an identity that is actively shaping behavior in a given context. Both contribute to a full picture, but for predicting action, salience often takes the lead.
Fascinating. Are there more recent studies supporting this?
Yes, more recent studies continue to affirm and elaborate on identity theory across various domains. A powerful longitudinal study, for example, followed over 1,000 science students from 2005 to 2013 and provided compelling evidence.
Okay, science students. What did it find?
It showed that students with a highly salient scientist identity, meaning they consistently identified as scientists, and this identity was regularly activated, sustained their intent to become working scientists over many years, even when controlling for factors like mentoring or funding.
Wow, so the identity itself was powerful.
Very powerful. And what maintained this salience? It was consistent involvement in proximate social structures, specifically high levels of interaction with other students who also had strong scientist identities, perhaps through study groups, research labs, or science clubs.
That's a direct and actionable connection for education. Creating those specific social structures sounds absolutely key to fostering long-term identity and career paths.
It absolutely is. This highlights how critical it is for teachers to consider fostering specific, identity-affirming social structures within their classrooms or schools. If you want students to develop and sustain a scientist or mathematician identity, for example, simply teaching them the facts isn't enough.
Right, you need the social piece.
You do. Creating a science club, encouraging a mathlete team, or deliberately forming study groups where students with similar academic interests can interact regularly, collaborate, and verify each other's identities can be incredibly powerful. These proximate social structures provide the commitment ties that maintain identity salience and consequently profoundly influence long-term behavioral intentions and career trajectories. You're not just teaching content, you're facilitating identity formation.
That's a huge takeaway. Any other examples?
Sure. Other research further supports these ideas across diverse contexts. A study on blood donors found that the greater the number of relationships based on a blood donor identity, perhaps through a community blood drive group, or having friends who are also regular donors, the higher the salience for that identity, leading to more frequent donations.
The social network reinforces the behavior.
Similarly, for first-time mothers, higher salience of the mother identity led to more consistent mothering behavior, more sacrifices in other areas of life to enact that role, and less seeking of assistance from others in performing the mother role. The stronger that identity was, the more fully they embraced its demands.
Okay. And back to science education.
And returning to science education, more specifically for high school students, research by Lee, conducted across multiple studies in the late 90s and early 2000s, showed that commitment and identity salience were highly influential in underwriting continued interest in science.
Okay, confirms the other findings.
Yes, but interestingly, Lee also investigated gender-related differences, finding that female students were more likely to perceive discrepancies between how they saw themselves, their internal self-perception, and how they perceived other science students, particularly the typical image of a scientist.
Ah, the stereotype problem.
Exactly. Controlling for these discrepancies actually accounted for some of the observed gender differences in interest and persistence in science.
That's a vital, actionable finding for teachers. It means that to encourage, say, girls in STEM, it's not enough to just teach the material or even just provide role models. You also need to actively create an inclusive classroom environment where all students, regardless of gender or background, feel that their emerging scientist or mathematician identity is verified, encouraged, and that they fit the image of a science student.
Precisely. Addressing those potential self-perception discrepancies, showing them they do belong, that there's no single type of scientist, becomes a crucial pedagogical priority, not just a side note.
Okay, that's a lot to chew on about how our social ties, our commitments, and the context we're in influence our identities and subsequent choices. But what about the internal experience? What happens inside us when our identity is challenged or affirmed? It sounds like there's more to it than just the social mirror and external commitments.
This raises an important question, yeah. How do our identities maintain themselves over time? Or, conversely, how do they change? And how do emotions play into that often unseen process? Two theories, identity control theory and affect control theory, delve into these crucial internal dynamics, offering a more nuanced view of the self's inner workings.
Okay, let's get into those. Identity control theory first.
Right. First, identity control theory, or ICT, developed by Peter Burke, shifts the focus slightly to examine the internal dynamics of our self-meanings, taking a cybernetic approach.
Cybernetic, like a feedback loop.
It's exactly like a feedback loop. At its core is the concept of an identity standard. This is the individual meanings a person holds representing who they are as a person in a given role. Burke sometimes calls these personal identities or self-enroll meanings. So, for instance, your identity standard might be, I am a helpful friend, or I am a responsible student.
So it's my internal ideal definition of myself in a given role. Like I have an internal blueprint for responsible student.
Exactly. That's a perfect way to put it. An internal blueprint or a set of meanings that define what that identity means to you. ICT then uses a cybernetic model, much like your home's thermostat systems.
Okay, the thermostat analogy.
Yeah. Just as a thermostat constantly compares the room temperature to a set ideal and then adjusts the heating or cooling, our internal identity system is continuously comparing our internal standard of who we are, our ideal self in a given role, to the real-time perceptions of how others view us and how we are behaving in the world.
So comparing the blueprint to reality.
Right. When we detect a discrepancy, a mismatch between our internal standard and the feedback we're getting from the social world, we engage in what's called self-verification.
Self-verification, trying to prove ourselves right.
Essentially, yes. This involves behaviors or interpretations aimed at reducing that discrepancy to maintain equilibrium and bring our perception of the situation back into alignment with our identity standard. We actively try to make the world confirm who we believe we are.
Okay.
However, if the disturbance, the mismatch, is too great and persistent, the identity itself may be forced to change, or we might even abandon that identity because it's no longer sustainable.
That makes sense. Can you give a classroom example of ICT?
Sure. Let's apply this to your classroom. Imagine a student whose identity standard is, I am a responsible student. If they perceive that a teacher or a peer views them as irresponsible, perhaps because they forgot their homework once or submitted a messy assignment, creating a discrepancy with their internal standard.
Right, a mismatch.
They might engage in self-verification. They might work harder on the very next assignment, meticulously ensure they are always on time, or even interpret ambiguous feedback as confirming their responsibility, just to reduce that gap and bring their perceived reality back in line with their internal blueprint.
Trying to fix the perception.
Exactly. And as a teacher, you can powerfully foster positive identity standards by providing clear, consistent feedback that explicitly verifies those desired identities. For example, saying, I really appreciate how responsible you are with your homework. It shows you care deeply about your learning. Directly verifies that responsible student identity standard, reinforcing their internal blueprint and reducing any discrepancy.
So feedback isn't just about grading, it's a powerful tool for shaping and reinforcing identity. That's a profound shift in perspective.
Precisely. Research in ICT has shown strong links between the meaning structure of an identity and consistent behavior. For instance, if a person's self-meaning as a worker includes specific meanings like accuracy and efficiency, they will behave consistently with those meanings in their job.
Okay.
In a classroom, if a student's student identity means curious and engaged, they are more likely to ask questions, participate actively in discussions, and seek out additional information. However, if their student identity primarily means quiet and compliant, they will behave quite differently, perhaps avoiding participation and adhering strictly to rules. The internal meaning structure profoundly drives the external behavior.
And does commitment play a role here too?
It does. ICT also highlights that greater commitment to an identity, those strong interactional and effective ties we discussed earlier, means a greater effort to ensure a match between that self-meaning and the feedback received.
More invested, try harder to match.
Right. Students who were rewarded for enacting their student identity and who had more ties with others who verified that identity showed a stronger link between their identity meanings and their behavior. It's a powerful feedback loop. Commitment reinforces the drive for verification, which in turn strengthens the identity.
And emotions. Does verification feel good?
Definitely. On an emotional level, verified identities, such as for spouses or friends, consistently led to more positive emotions like pride and satisfaction. Conversely, a lack of verification can lead to negative emotional states, identity distress, and even disengagement.
Okay, that covers identity control theory. What about the other one, affect control theory?
Now let's move to affect control theory, or ACT, developed by David Hayes. This theory takes a different but highly complementary approach. It views interactions not just through cognitive meanings, but based on affective meanings. Essentially, the underlying emotional and cultural attitudes attached to people, actions, and objects within an interaction.
So it's about the emotional flavor or feeling of an interaction, like a social thermostat for emotions.
Exactly. It's a brilliant way to put it. Every element in an interaction, the person acting, the person being acted upon, and the action itself, has a fundamental cultural affective value. Think of common triads like mother feeds child versus mother strikes child.
Big difference in feeling there.
Huge difference. Each of those words, mother, child, feeds, strikes, has an inherent cultural meaning, an emotional valence that most people in a shared culture intuitively understand. These meanings are measured across 3 universal dimensions. Evaluation, is it good or bad, like mother good? Potency, is it strong or weak, like striking strong? And activity, is it active or passive, like feeding active?
EPA, evaluation, potency, activity.
You got it. EPA. These are captured in extensive cultural meaning dictionaries through vast empirical research. ACT posits that individuals strive to maintain affective equilibrium. If an element's existing affective value, its established EPA score, is disturbed by an event, if something happens that feels wrong emotionally or culturally.
Right, the mother strikes child example.
Exactly. If that happens, the elements involved will adjust to restore that equilibrium, almost like a self-correcting emotional system. For instance, if the event is mother hurts child, which has a highly negative affective impact, ACT predicts that either the affective value of mother or child, or both, will become more negative in an observer's mind in order to maintain the overall affective balance of the situation.
So the feelings have to balance out somehow.
Right. It's an unconscious cognitive process to make sense of emotional deviance. Identity change happens if the disturbance is so great that the effective meanings of the identity cannot be brought back into alignment with the other elements.
So if a good student does something bad, there's an automatic, often subconscious drive to make sense of it emotionally, either by reevaluating the student or the action. It's almost like a mental accounting for feeling.
Precisely. Imagine a student who is generally perceived by the class, and you, the teacher, as good. High positive evaluation, perhaps neutral potency, and active. If that student suddenly disrupts class, an action with negative activity, negative evaluation, ACT predicts that either the student's affective meaning will shift, they might become seen as less good or more troublesome, or the action's meaning will be reinterpreted. Perhaps the disruption is seen as a one-off mistake, rather than a fundamental character flaw, or even the entire class's overall effective meaning might shift due to the disruption.
And the teacher manages this.
Constantly. As a teacher, you are constantly managing these effective meanings through your reactions, your tone of voice, your feedback, and how you frame situations. You shape how students perceive themselves and others, influencing their emotional equilibrium and, in turn, their identities. For example, if you praise a student, not only does it reinforce their identity, but it also makes them feel proud. And ACT predicts they'll likely continue to behave in ways that maintain that positive feeling about themselves, seeking out actions that align with that positive affective state.
Makes sense. Maintain the good feelings.
Right. Empirical research in ACT involves meticulously measuring these cultural meaning dictionaries, using those evaluation, potency, and activity scales, and then applying them to understand various phenomena like emotions, occupational roles, and even judgments about criminal defendants. For example, studies have shown that when individuals are praised, they subsequently become friendlier in subsequent interactions.
Wow, interesting. Why?
Well, it isn't just politeness. ACT suggests it's an active way to maintain the stability of their identity and behavior in line with the positive affect of praise. And consistent with symbolic interactionism's emphasis on symbols, simply imagining praise can make someone feel proud and even produce physiological responses, just as imagining failure can induce shame or anger. This demonstrates the powerful link between cognitive processes, social symbols, and emotional states in identity formation and maintenance.
Wow. Okay, so these theories give us a much richer picture of the internal dynamics. This deep dive really isn't just about individual psychology or isolated interactions, is it? It helps us see how these micro-level dynamics and internal processes ripple out into larger social structures, shaping entire institutions. It's about bridging the gaps between different ways of thinking about human behavior and society, showing the interconnectedness.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, yes, the capacity of these theories to bridge to all alternative theoretical frames is absolutely essential for a truly comprehensive understanding of social life. No single theory can explain everything, so seeing how these concepts fit with and enrich others is vital for building a holistic perspective.
So what are some of those bridges?
Let's look at bridges to other social psychology theories. One significant connection is with expectation states theory.
Expectation states, what's that about?
This theory developed from research on how unacquainted groups, like a new classroom group at the start of the year or a new project team, quickly form status structures and performance expectations.
Ah, like figuring out the pecking order.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
These expectations are often based on subtle cues like appearance, speech patterns, early contributions to a task, or even pre-existing social categories like gender or race. And critically, these initial expectations can then reinforce existing inequalities, leading to self-fulfilling prophecies.
This sounds incredibly relevant for an elementary education major. How does a child's pre-existent identities affect those expectations in the classroom, and what can a teacher do about it?
It's highly, highly relevant. For example, a child who has internalized a not good at math identity, perhaps from previous experiences in another school or from messages they've received at home, might enter a group math task with a negative performance expectation for themselves.
Right, they expect to fail.
And other students in the group, picking up on subtle cues from that child's hesitant behavior or even their own prior knowledge about the child, might also form a similar negative expectation. This can then create a vicious cycle, reinforcing the child's own self-perception and negatively impacting their actual performance.
So how can a teacher break that cycle?
Well, the profound challenge for you as a teacher is to understand how these pre-existent salient identities and the expectations they generate impact those initial performance expectations in a group. The good news is that expectation states research has actually shown that it is possible to intervene.
Oh.
A teacher, armed with this insight, can strategically highlight a child's unique contribution or skill in another area, or deliberately structure tasks to create new, positive expectations for a student. For instance, if a child struggles with math but excels at art, you could design a math activity that involves visual representation and collaboration, allowing their artist identity to shine and generate positive performance expectations from their peers.
Change the context to change the expectation.
Exactly. The theory also explores how to ensure these positive expectations carry over to future group interactions, creating a lasting shift in how the child is perceived by others, and crucially, how they perceive themselves in that context. You're actively reshaping the social mirror for them.
That's really powerful. Any other bridges?
There's also a clear bridge to exchange theory, which looks at how repeated positive exchanges like students successfully collaborating on a project and feeling a sense of shared accomplishment, or a teacher consistently providing affirmation and supportive feedback, can generate positive emotions and build commitment to relationships and the associated identities.
So positive interactions build commitment.
Right. Lawler's work, for instance, has brilliantly integrated symbolic interactionist ideas into exchange theory, arguing that when actors are effectively attached to groups, their commitment to identities attached to the roles within that group increases. And reciprocally, when identity-related role relationships within a group are strong and mutually beneficial, the effective ties to the group itself are strengthened. It's a powerful, virtuous cycle where positive interaction reinforces identity, which in turn reinforces positive interaction.
Okay. And what about connections to the broader field of psychology, like cognitive social psychology or social identity theory? Where do these sociological insights meet those psychological perspectives?
Excellent question. Psychologists' increasing interest in the self has really opened the door for rich dialogue between sociological and psychological social psychology. Identity theory owes a significant debt to the cognitive psychology idea of selves as cognitive schemata.
Right, the mental frameworks idea.
Exactly, meaning our identities are like mental frameworks that help us process information and guide our attention. If you have highly salient student identity, you're more likely to quickly recognize and act on opportunities for student-related activities, like joining a study group or prioritizing homework.
Makes sense. But what does SI add?
However, symbolic interactionism adds a crucial, often overlooked layer here. While cognitive theorists sometimes assume that human experiences are somewhat random or simply based on individual processing, SI reminds us that they are not. Our social locations, our social class, our ethnicity, our gender, our age actively channel us into specific types of social relationships and experiences that profoundly shape our self-concepts and the very schemata we develop.
So our background shakes the frameworks themselves.
Profoundly. So as a teacher, you can understand that a student's self-concept as a reader isn't just about their internal cognition or their individual ability. It's also deeply influenced by their family's literacy practices at home, the presence of books, the cultural value placed on reading in their community, and the overall reading culture within the school itself. Recognizing these structural sources of experience deepens our understanding beyond purely cognitive explanations.
Right. Context matters hugely. What about social identity theory? How does that fit?
Then there's the important distinction and growing convergence between social identity theory and role identity. Social identity theory, primarily from social psychology, is about perceived membership in a broader social category.
Yeah.
Things like being a girl, being an athlete, being a sports fan, or being an artist.
Big group memberships.
Right. Role identity, on the other hand, as we've discussed in identity theory, is about internalizing role expectations and performing your behaviors in specific social networks, like being a student in your classroom or being a member of the school basketball team.
Specific roles in specific groups.
Exactly. While historically viewed as quite distinct, recent work shows these are interconnected and influence each other. For example, a girl's social identity as female might influence how she perceives her role identity in a typically male-dominated STEM class, and how others perceive her in that context. This is about bridging how we categorize ourselves and are categorized by society with how we enact specific roles in specific relationships and how those categories shape our role performance.
So it's not just who I am, but who I am in this group and who I am in this specific role. It layers our understanding of identity.
Precisely. And finally, these theories bridge to other larger segments of sociology, like organizational sociology.
How does identity play out in big organizations?
Well, Robin Stryker's work, for instance, has compellingly shown how professional role identities, like those of economists versus lawyers within a government agency, profoundly influenced decision-making processes and even led to the reshaping of entire institutions. These professional identities, carrying specific meanings, values, and decision-making logics, can profoundly impact organizational change and stability.
So being an economist changes how you approach problems.
Fundamentally. This also extends to how social movements can foster deep cultural change by strategically reshaping meanings and redefining professional identities. Think about the historical shift in French gastronomy from classical, rigid cuisine to nouvelle cuisine. It wasn't just about new dishes, but about redefining what it meant to be a chef and fundamentally altering the professional identity of that role.
Changing the meaning of the identity itself.
Right. Similarly, individual leaders' personal identities strongly impact organizational identities. In your educational context, a school's identity as innovative or community-focused might be largely driven by the principal's personal identity as an innovator or a community builder. This, in turn, deeply influences the roles and identities that teachers and students adopt within that school, shaping the entire institutional culture. Identity at all levels is a dynamic force for stability and change.
What an incredible journey. From 18th century philosophers pondering the social mirror, to the intricate internal workings of the I and me, and then out to the powerful dynamics of classrooms, social groups, and even vast organizations. It's truly comprehensive.
It is truly comprehensive. We've seen how symbolic interactionism, particularly the structural approach, provides an incredibly rich framework for understanding that our identities aren't fixed or singular. Instead, they are constantly shaped and reshaped through our ongoing social interactions and the commitments we make to various social networks.
And how our identities then guide what we do.
And in turn, our identities then powerfully guide our behavior and the choices we make. Identity theory provides that precise, empirically testable model, showing how our social commitment leads to identity salience, which ultimately drives our role choices.
Right. Commitment, salience, role choice.
And then identity control theory and effect control theory delves even deeper, illuminating the internal processes of self-verification and emotional equilibrium that either keep our identity stable in the face of feedback or trigger profound change when the disturbance is too great.
And we've seen how these micro-level theories bridge seamlessly to larger sociological concepts, demonstrating that our personal identities are deeply intertwined with broader social structures and categories, like gender, class, and the expectations embedded within every group we join. It's a continuous reciprocal dance between the individual and society.
This understanding of identity as something so deeply intertwined with social structure and continuous interaction holds truly profound implications for education. As you go forward, how might recognizing the multiple, often competing identities students bring into the classroom, say their friend identity versus their student identity, or their artist identity versus their math whiz identity, fundamentally change how you approach teaching?
Yeah, how do you manage all those competing identities?
How might it reshape your efforts to foster a true sense of belonging and encourage learning for every single child? Consider this. As a teacher, through every interaction, every rule you set, every piece of feedback you give, and every opportunity you provide, you are constantly creating and holding up the social mirror for your students. What kind of reflections do you want them to see of themselves, and how will that shape who they become?